Hey everyone. All right, I said I would share my process for making sourdough bread. I actually started doing this back in February, I think, before like everyone got into bread making. It's just something that I've always wanted to do. And so I finally got a little system. I'm probably not the best person to show you how to do sourdough. I am by no means an expert. I'm probably doing a million things wrong, but we get really yummy bread like once a week. So I'm okay with that. So I'm gonna show you my process. And the first thing it starts off with is having some starter. So you can make your own starter, and it's the craziest thing because it's literally just made with flour and water. So I just buy organic flour and I use filtered water. And basically when you put those two together and you leave it out, the flour will start to ferment. And the process to create your own starter to where it's bubbly enough to actually raise a loaf of bread probably takes about like a week to 10 days or more, depending upon the temperature. So fermenting is very temperature dependent. I used to make kombucha for several years, and in the summer when it was warmer, like in the house, it would ferment a lot more quickly. Like sometimes I could get a whole batch done in like 6 days, but in the winter when the indoor temps were cooler, sometimes it would maybe take 10 days to ferment. So fermentation is very dependent upon the temperature. So if you are starting your starter in the summer, you might be able to do it, maybe in a week. But if you're doing it in the winter when it's just a little bit cooler inside, it might take you longer. So it's literally a process of like doing flour and water and letting it sit, and then you discard an amount of it and you add more flour and water, let it sit, and you'll see it will get bubbly. And then you discard, add more flour and water. So it's a process. It's kind of like babysitting a baby for those few days when you're creating your starter. You have to feed it a few times a day. I will link you the recipe that I used to make my starter. It was really simple. It's time consuming in the standpoint of you have to make sure that you're feeding it at the right time. And it's forgiving. It's not like crazy, but it is a little more concentrated effort to get your starter formed. Okay, probably the most annoying part of making your starter is that you have so much discard. So every time, during the time where you're cultivating your starter, you're actually gonna be discarding some every time you feed it, and then you're gonna feed it more water and flour. Wait for time to go, let it rise and get bubbly, discard some, feed it flour and water. Let it rise, get bubbly, discard some, feed it flour and water. So you have a lot of discard at the end, and so I actually would just kind of keep it in jars in the fridge, and then I would use it if I was making pancakes or English muffins. Like you're making a little bit more like baked goods than you probably would normally make, at least we were. But now that I have my starter, I store this in the fridge and I make bread just once a week. And the reason I store it in the fridge is to cool down, to slow down that fermentation process so it doesn't overly ferment. And then I can use this when I make bread. So today is bread day. I do this about once a week. I pull it out of the fridge. I leave it out for a couple of hours just to kind of warm up, get bubbly again. You can see this texture is very, I don't know if runny is a good word, but it's definitely not the same as when you first mix in the flour and the water. So you can tell fermentation has definitely occurred. It smells like sourdough, smells kind of like sweet. So, and then when it's time to make my bread, I just take out my bowl. I use my KitchenAid mixer to mix my bread. And my recipe here, so I'll share this too. So basically I just have 3 recipes. I have my actual bread recipe. I have my recipe for then refeeding my starter after I have used it for the day. And then I have my initial recipe for creating my starter. So I will share all of those with you. But for my actual bread recipe, you just kind of give this a stir, and I use a kitchen scale just because it makes things a lot more accurate. And you just put it in grams. Everything is done in grams when you're making bread. Set this on there, and so this recipe uses 250 grams of starter. So you just measure that out. Okay, and then I'm just gonna add my other ingredients. So for this recipe, it's literally flour, the starter, which I just added, some sugar that's optional, some sea salt, and some water, and that's it. And I let it mix in my KitchenAid, until it passes the window pane test. So I will show you what that looks like when I get to that stage. And then that's basically my bread. And so I'll talk about that in a minute, how I actually make the bread and what that looks like. But then I have a little bit, I don't know if you can tell, I mean, there's still some starter left in here. So what I need to do is I need to feed it so it will be ready to go for next time. So to feed my starter, you need about 113 grams of starter in here, which I've got this down to a science now. I weigh this and I see how much I have and how close I am, because I know how much I'll need for my next recipe. So I'll know I'll need 250 grams next time I make a loaf of bread. And I know that I need 113 grams to restart it, if that makes sense. So basically I just weigh this and make sure that I have about 13 grams or so. It's definitely not going to be exact. And so I'll take like an empty jar and weigh it to find out how much starter I have. And then if I'm short, I'll just add that additional flour or water. So normally, like at this step, what I'll do is you have 113 grams of starter, you add 113 grams of flour and 113 grams of water to restart your starter for next time. Okay, so to figure out how much starter I actually have in there and how much I need to fudge and make up, I'm gonna weigh an empty jar and tear it out, you know, hit the tear button, make it go to 0. And then I'm gonna stick my jar with flour on it, or with my starter on it. And it shows I have 110 grams, perfect. So what I usually do is to feed it, it's like I said, usually, and it really comes out to be about a cup of flour and a half cup of water. Again, I like to go by grams just because then I know I'm not short. And so I usually add they say to add about 113. I usually add about 130 of each, just so I know I'll have enough for my next batch of bread and I'm not gonna be short, and I'll have plenty of starter to restart. Because if you don't have enough starter, it's not gonna have enough yeast in it in order to ferment your next batch of starter. Does that make sense? Okay, so I'm gonna tear out my scale again, and I'm going to just put flour in. Again, this is just organic flour, organic white flour. And if you don't know, sourdough actually, like the process of fermentation, kind of pre-digests some of the gluten. And so people who are gluten sensitive can sometimes eat sourdough bread without a problem because some of the gluten is pre-digested. So that's really cool. So I just put 130 grams of flour in here, and I'm gonna add 130 grams of water. Okay. And I just keep tearing out my scale, getting it back to 0, and that way I can just easily measure out what I'm adding. Okay, so I gotta add a little more water, so I'm just add a little more flour. Okay, so now I've added equal parts of flour and water to my remaining starter. I'm just gonna stir that around. And then this, and you'll see, remember I showed you how liquidy that was? I mean, this is like, right? It's kind of chunky, and you wanna stir it as best you can. Try to get as many of the lumps and stuff out as you can. Just keep stirring it in there. And even though it's in the fridge, it will ferment. It just will happen at a much slower rate. Again, because I don't want to make bread every day. If you wanted to make bread every day, you could leave this on your counter and keep feeding it. Now I will say, probably most bread makers, like as their starter is fermenting, they're still doing the discard and feed process and discard and feed to get a really active, bubbly starter, and their baked goods probably rise more than mine. I don't like the maintenance of that, and I don't like having that much to throw away or figure out what to do with. So this is the process that works for us. Okay, so this is about as good as it's gonna get stir-wise. So I'm gonna show you the consistency. Can you see what that's like? It's nothing like what I showed you. So you saw at the beginning, it was very like liquidy and runny. Let me see if I can show you. Can you see how runny that is? That's the starter for my bread that we're gonna use. So anyways, so basically I'm gonna cover this. I will cover this, and then I'm gonna set this on my counter for a couple of hours just to let it get a chance to start getting bubbly and getting fermented. And then I'm gonna stick it in the fridge and just leave it in there for a week. And the next week I'll pull this back out, use some of it to make my next batch of bread, feed the remaining, and that's how it keeps going, okay? So now that part is done. Let's get back to the bread making. And so like I said, I'm going to add all of these ingredients that I was telling you about. So just flour, water, salt, and a little bit of sugar. So I'm gonna do that, and once all of that is in here, I will show it to you. Ingredients are added, and I just let this stir until it's all combined. A note about the recipe that I used for the sandwich bread is that I use less water than it calls for because I was just finding that it was too wet to form a nice dough ball. So I use a little bit less, and then you'll just have to play around and to try to get the right texture, and you won't know right away. You'll just have to play around and see what's working. But I'm gonna go ahead and let this mix and be back in a bit. Okay, I know this isn't ready, but I'm gonna show you what this looks like when you're looking for the window pane test. So I just have a dough hook on here. You could obviously knead this by hand. I don't wanna sit around the kitchen for too long doing this. I let this go while I'm doing other things. So, but you could certainly do this by hand. But the window pane test is the thing you're looking for when you know the dough is done being kneaded. And that is when you can pull this apart and it doesn't split and you can see light through it. This actually is not too bad. Well, do you see how that ripped? So we're getting there, but we still have a little ways to go. The dough or the window pane test, it'll look like a window pane of glass when you kind of stretch this and you can see through it without ripping like that. So we just need to continue to develop the gluten. So I'm gonna turn this back on and let it keep spinning. Okay, I just stopped this from kneading. I could probably let it go for a little longer, but to be honest, I'm in a little bit of a hurry, but I'm gonna show you, I don't know, you probably can't see this because there's not light behind me, but when I hold this up, I can see that it's showing light through it and it's not ripping right away. And so this is pretty good. It's showing that the gluten is fairly developed. Like I said, I could probably let it go a little bit longer, but this looks good enough for me for now. So basically, all you're gonna do is just take your all the dough, gather it up. This is why you don't want it to be too wet. Gather it all up and I kind of knead it over a few times and I put it into like a nice big ball, and then this will proof for about 8 hours or so. So normally I just will set this on my counter covered either with a damp towel, or you can even just put some saran wrap over it to hold the moisture in. And that's usually what I do just because it works a little bit better. But I just make it into a ball, take a bowl, put it in the bottom and cover it, okay? And then cover it, and then you can leave it on your counter, especially if it's like warm, or my oven has a proof setting. So if your oven has a proof setting, that's the perfect place for it. But if not, you can just leave it out and you're gonna wait about 8 hours or so. The rule of thumb is that this ball will double in size. All of that yeast that was developed in your starter will ferment this bread, and it will expand and create air. And so that's what I'm gonna do next. Two things. My dough ball has definitely doubled in size. It was in my proofing oven on the proof setting, and he has definitely doubled. He's very big. And also, you can see how bubbly this starter has gotten as well, the one that I made this morning. So this was just, if you remember, it was just the starter, and I added flour and water and let it sit, and you can see it's working. The yeast is alive and well. So I'm gonna stick this in my fridge till next week, and then I'm basically gonna follow the rest of the directions on the recipe for this and shape it into a loaf and then bake it, and I'll show it to you when it's done. Here is the final product. When I don't feed my starter multiple times before I use it, the bread doesn't rise as much, but for us, this is fine. It's almost a cross between like a baguette and a loaf of bread, so we can still make like little sandwiches on it, or we can cut it and have it with dinner. Again, if I wanted it to rise more, I would like feed my starter multiple times before I used it, but I just pull it from the fridge, let it warm up, and then I use it. Still get a pretty decent rise on it, and that's it. I hope this was helpful.